Dr. Elizabeth Chalecki, Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. Dr. Chalecki came to the University of Nebraska in August of 2014. She earned her PhD in International Relations from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. And she also earned a Master of Science in Environmental Geography from the University of Toronto. She's a non-resident fellow at the Stimson Center, is a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank devoted to addressing transnational challenges in order to enhance global peace and economic prosperity. Dr. Chalecki recently concluded a fellowship at Goucher College at the Visiting Mellon Scholar for Environmental Studies. She has taught at Boston College, Boston University, California State University Hayward, and the Monterey Institute of International Studies. She has also worked for the Pacific Institute, Environment Canada, and the U.S. Department of Commerce and the Brookings Institution. Dr. Chalecki challenges transboundary environmental security and foreign policy topics, such as climate change and security, international environmental policy, and the intersection of science and international relations. Please welcome her to Mad Scientist.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I was very happy to get this invitation when Dr. Hutchinson emailed me to come to a conference called Mad Scientist. I thought, excellent. Now I really get to do what I always wanted to do, which is be a mad scientist. And if I had a white lab coat, I would be wearing it right now. I see mad scientist as a compliment, not like mad genius, not like mad generals. So what I'm going to talk to you today, about environmental security. And this is a topic, I think, that gets overlooked and underrated in security studies. And I've been pushing this rock up the security studies hill for a very long time. When I wrote my dissertation in 2008 on the security effects of climate change, I couldn't get anybody to talk to me about it. They thought that was insane. What do you mean climate change has security effects? That's crazy. Now, 10 years on, of course they're saying, yeah, of course it has security effects. It's the threat multiplier. All right. We're going to look forward. Now, I thought the time frame we're aiming for here is 2050, but apparently it's now 2025, 2030. Well, whatever, we're going to go with it. What I'm going to do for you today, because the operational environment that we talk about is a wholly owned subsidiary of the actual environment, I'm going to describe to you what we know currently about the connections between environment, resources, climate, and some of the security threats that they can engender or make worse. And so we're going to start talking about that. Conventional views of national security. There's a picture of STRATCOM. I teach at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. STRATCOM is not too far away. I was at a 2-day conference put on by STRATCOM on deterrence and assurance, and not once did anybody mention anything other than Russia, China, and nukes. Occasionally, Iran got some airtime. And when I asked a question of General Haney, the 3-star that runs the place, how do we deter China from building another 500 coal-fired power plants, he blinked at me like I was speaking Swahili. So I hope we're going to get a little madder in this conference here. Conventional views of national security. Security is something that results from military victory on the battlefield. Your sovereign nation has been defended by your armed forces, and as a result, you are now secure. This is our traditional view. Well, this doesn't hold up as much now that we're dealing with a more interconnected world. Realists, that political strain that says that every nation acts independently, basically says that security is a zero-sum game. Morality is irrelevant. What you should do is secure your nation. Everything else takes second fiddle. And the sovereign nations are inviolable. But this sovereign idea, this idea of sovereign territory, when you look at it from an ecological point of view, you realize just what an artificial construct sovereignty really is. The airspace above us might be American airspace, but it is not American atmosphere. So how do we protect our nation in a changing, literal environment? Collective security has often been put up as the other option, but this is problematic as well. Different nations have different things that they want to secure. So as a result, how do you work with other nations to do this when there's a high probability of defection back to that realist model? Security has traditionally been considered high politics, and everything else took second place to that. Other concerns, economics, demographics, public health, ecology and environment, education, this is usually relegated to lesser priority. Now, with all due respect to Dr. Rice, he said that geopolitics and geography doesn't change. Well, the politics might not change, but the geo will. So what is all this environment, and why do we want it? This is a partial list of ecosystem services. This is what the environment does for us, things we either can't do or don't want to do ourselves. Climate stabilization, moderation of weather extremes. I'm not going to read all these for you. Bees punch above their weight in the ecosystem, much like Nazi Germany. And The total value of these ecosystem services was calculated by a team of economists in 2011. It was actually an update of an earlier paper. $125 trillion. I'm sorry, that doesn't come out well on the slide. If I'd known red wouldn't show up, I wouldn't have put it there. $125 trillion in 2011. Now, as a point of reference, global GDP that year was $62 trillion. Nature provides for us twice what we can provide for ourselves, and it does it for free. Some of these things, as I mentioned, we cannot replicate. So we're going to take a look at the connection now between security and natural resources. Resources are seen to be a benefit, and most economic models show increasing growth and so on coming out of resources, but those resources don't come from nowhere. They come out of the earth. So how do we manage these? There we go. Number one, water. If you don't have fresh water, you ain't got nothing. It's attributed to Mark Twain that he said water is for fighting over. Whiskey's for sipping and water's for fighting over. Well, he wasn't too far wrong about that, and I like a good whiskey. Business as usual, water productivity. I want to show you this map right here. Water stress percent of total renewable water withdrawn. Water is a renewable resource, but it's one of the few renewable resources that we can make non-renewable by overuse or by pollution. So if you look at this map here, this is Icefree and Veolia's estimate for 2050 as to which nations, and that's not even actually a national map, that's based on river basins and watersheds, which ones are going to be overdrawn. I wonder if there's any security threats in any of these areas we might be dealing with. Probably so. And there is no way in which a water shortage makes it better. There's a picture of water shortages in China right now, and you can see an estimate, again in 2050, of the number of billions of people, not millions of people, not thousands, billions of people affected by water shortages. So if we don't have water, you don't have anything. You don't have agriculture, you don't have industry, you don't have domestic growth, you don't have security. We can't create more water. Desalination, that's not an option on a large scale. It's very energy intensive, very difficult. What I call lootable resources. These are the resources that fuel conflict. If you look at these pictures, you'll recognize some of these. Now, those giant mountains that look like salt, that is the Bolivian salt flats. They are very rich in lithium. Lithium is in every one of your batteries right now, or should be, and will be shortly. They are the world's largest repository of lithium. Those are teak trees, those are mahogany logs, rough-cut diamonds, gold, and that's coltan, what's being held in these folks' hands here. That's coltan. These are coca leaves. Coltan, of course, comes from the DRC. If you've been following the news at all, and I know this is a security-focused crowd, so of course you have been, you know what's going on in the DRC and how long it's been going on. Bolivia does not want to become another DRC. They want to manage their resources in such a way as to remain stable, but it remains to be seen whether or not they can do this. Dutch disease. This is a problem. When a nation when they find a resource, their economy actually gets worse. It devolves away from diversity of production and intellectual capital, if you will, and towards development of this resource. We actually saw this happen with the Dutch and a number of other nations. So finding a resource is not necessarily a blessing. It can be a curse, literally. This map here from the New York Times, I think that's about a 2010 map. This is minerals found in Afghanistan. $908 billion, estimated in dollars of the time, so it's probably more than that now, of these critical minerals we need, iron, copper, niobium, and so on. Resources alone don't cause a conflict. This is the resource curse. How would we get these minerals out of Afghanistan without making the political and security situation there worse? I don't know. Nobody does. Because the government there is so non-transparent and corrupt and factionalized that any wealth coming in there is only going to make the situation worse, not better. If a state like the UK or Norway has a well-functioning, transparent government, then they can manage wealth, such as UK and Norway did when they found oil in the North Sea. But a government like Afghanistan's, if they were to start selling out these mining contracts and digging up this wealth, they would be in real trouble. We would be there in 2050, and I hate to say that. Petroleum. This is a particular kind of lootable resource. Much harder to loot than most because it's not so portable. You have to put in permanent infrastructure. This is a map from the BP Energy Outlook in 2016 of global energy flows. Now, we saw in a previous slide about the possibility of decentralized energy production that would certainly stop a lot of oil moving around, except we don't really have a good, most oil is used for transportation, we don't really have a good substitute for transportation fuel at this point. We can generate electricity using solar and wind and so on, but not really transportation fuel. So this isn't going to slow down this trade anytime soon. In 1997, a political scientist named Terry Lynn Carl coined the term petrostates, and she was talking about countries who develop poorly, a form of Dutch disease, because of petroleum. Look what's happening in Venezuela right now. That was the topic of her dissertation. We know what's happening there, and it's because the petroleum wealth made the country maldevelop. And now we see the conflict in Venezuela spilling over into other nations. Both importers and exporters are dependent. If we went through another supply-led oil shock, gas prices would shoot up, there'd be complaints all over the place. Politicians would be trying to say, in my administration, oil will be $1.50 a gallon. They can't promise that. Nobody can. So in the meantime, not only is the resource itself not doing our climate any good, but the infrastructure is vulnerable to sabotage from disaffected militants, as we see happening right now in the Congo and in Nigeria. And choke points in this transit around the world could mean one accident, one very well-timed sinking of a tanker, one very well-timed maneuver by Iran or by Malaysia or whomever could put a stop to this oil transit. Food insecurity. If you don't have food, how are you going to provide for your citizens? And I have pictures there of various food riots around the world. That sign this woman has right here in Venezuela literally says, "We are dying of hunger." Morimos de hambre. Food security has 4 pillars. One, availability. There has to be food to have. The food has to exist in order to get to hungry people. Number 2, access. If the food exists and is sitting in a warehouse, it doesn't do any good. You have to get it to people. Number 3, utilization. So you get them the food, but if they don't have any fresh water, there's no point in giving them grains you have to cook. They have to be able to use the food with the resources they have. And finally, stability. This has to happen every year, not just 1 year. These are the 4 pillars of durable food security. If you don't have water, if you have conflict, if you have economic maldevelopment, you will not have food security. Now, factors that affect food production, there's a number of them there. I'm not going to go into them in any great detail. And factors that affect food distribution are not necessarily the same. There can be food, and it doesn't get to the people it needs to get to. Feminogenic behavior is another political science term. I'm forgetting the name of the guy who coined it, but he is talking about famines, not just food shortages, but famines as politically engineered events. That a government that wishes to suppress a particular population can engineer a famine by withholding food. We've seen this happen in North Korea right now. We've seen this happen in Ukraine. It's happened in various places around the world. So that's a combination of environmental security and regular security. Well, an internal famine might be a problem for that country, but what happens when that country takes an aggressive posture overseas? Now all of a sudden it's somebody else's problem. Climate change. I'm going to try to keep my eye on the clock here and move us through. How do we account for climate change as a threat multiplier? And what kind of inputs do we need if we want to put any of this data into a conflict model? All right. This is from the latest IPCC report. The IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. AR5 is their last report. They geeked out a little bit on the science, so forget about what RCP 2.6 and 8.5 mean. The functional difference between these 2 Earths is that this one is the one we're going to have, to the best of our knowledge, if we go heavily to renewable and nuclear energy. Heavily. Away from fossil fuels, away from natural gas, away from coal, certainly, hence my question to Admiral Haney, and towards wind, tidal, nuclear. It's not renewable, but it is carbon-free. We are still looking at, over land, 1.52 degrees change in average temperature over the course of a century. Where do the people live? Where's the food produced? Where's security determined? Exactly right there. And the Arctic at this point is still looking like 3 and 4 and 5 degrees above normal. That's going to be a completely changed landscape up there. And this is the good estimate. What strikes you about this map? Other than it's practically completely red-orange. You can't see as well here. I'm sorry, the lighting isn't perfect. You can't see as well here, but the Arctic is practically black. The Arctic is off the scale here, and this is degrees centigrade, not degrees Fahrenheit. This is what happens if we stay business as usual, if we don't make these necessary sustainability changes. We are looking at overland temperature increases of 5, 6, 7 degrees Fahrenheit. That is going to, unless we have some kind of engineer some kind of fantastic agriculture that can survive that kind of heat and drought, we are going to be looking at massive food security shortages, massive changes in infectious disease, which I'll talk about in a minute, and massive insecurity. Now, this is the precipitation model. I'll cop to this right now. The precipitation models are not as clear. This is one thing that climate models have a harder time representing with as much exactitude as they do the temperature models. But again, you can see the Earth there is renewable energy, and you're still looking at some drying over land. This is business as usual, a whole lot more precipitation. Now, this is measured in change in percent. So if you look at a place like this sub-Sahel right there, you can see it looks pretty blue. Well, if they get 2 millimeters of rain per year, then they're going to get a whopping 3 under this model. But you can see a lot of precipitation changing across Antarctica and across the Arctic. This does not mean that it's coming down as snow. This means that it's coming down as rain. Well, that is going to open up the Arctic even faster. I'll skip the lecture about the ice and albedo effect. All right, Icefree Arctic. I don't even put a date on this anymore. Every time I pick up the literature, there's a new date as to when we get an ice-free Arctic. That's not just a matter of environmental curiosity. This is going to be a new world. We have never lived in this world before. Humans have never lived in an open water Arctic. Well, we're going to be seeing it. We might keep some ice if we move to renewable energy. If we stay with business as usual, no. And ocean acidification, this is the last one. It's not as clear yet what the security implications of this would be, but when you consider the number of people around the world who rely on fish as their main source of protein, roughly one person in every 5 relies on fish. What is that going to do to global fish stocks? What is that going to do to the ability of the ocean to act as a heat sink? We simply don't know. We've never lived in this world before. So what's going to happen in the Arctic? This fascinates me. I took this recently from the National Snow and Ice Data Center, and it runs, I was going to stick the whole video in here and thought, but basically it runs forward in time, and you can see the sea ice changing. Sea ice is getting thinner. It's melting because of the geographic peculiarities of the basin. It melts faster on the Russian side. So the Northern Sea route comes open before the Northwest Passage. Not that the Canadians are keen to have people in the Northwest Passage anyway, till they declare it's theirs. But the Russians absolutely have their eye on the Northern Sea route as a method of shipping. They want to open this up. They want to get a lot of money from people going through there. They've got the icebreakers to support this grand ambition. And in 2015, Putin will be a robust 98 years old. He will still be running things, not having lost a step. And he will absolutely see the future here in the Arctic, which is why he's putting resources into it now, security resources, not just economic resources. He is putting icebreakers up there. He is training troops. He is generating soft power. He has a plan to make the Arctic Russian, all the way up to the North Pole, all the way up to the giant candy cane in the snow in Santa's workshop, all Russian. He's going to do it, too, if we don't get our butts in gear. Resources up there include petroleum, strategic minerals, and cold water aquaculture. If, in fact, the oceans keep heating up, that is going to be a valuable use of cold Arctic waters, is growing fish, cold water fish that we can eat. And then, as I mentioned, transit across the Northern Sea route is going to open up considerably. Migration. This is going to be a huge problem. We already see this now. We see this now, and we haven't even got the foggiest idea of what it's going to look like in the future. How many people are going to be displaced? Again, I don't even want to put a number on how many millions of people because it changes with every estimate. But this is something that we are going to have to address because these people are not just going to stay in one place and quietly accept their fate. They're going to try to pick up and move. I would. Now, climate change is going to affect push factors more than pull factors. This is a political science term. Push factors being the thing that pushes you out of your country. The drought, the famine, the floods, the fighting, the disease. And pull factors are what pull you towards a particular area. It's no surprise that as many migrants as possible from Syria and Iraq are going towards Europe. They want a stable climate. They want a stable economy. They want to try to rebuild their lives. Well, if you look at this UN definition of a refugee, which I'm not going to read for you, you will notice that this is a Cold War definition. There is one particular generating factor that is not mentioned, and that is the environment. When this was written, this was designed to get people out from behind the Iron Curtain, not take in up to 150 million climate refugees from nations like Bangladesh, who are going to see intense amounts of flooding, or small island states who will be washed out of existence. Refugees are protected right now, anyway, by the concept of non-refoulement. This means you can't send a refugee, once they cross the border into another state, you can't send them back to the state where their lives are in danger. That principle might be jettisoned. If millions of people are trying to get across the border away from a climate flood, climate disaster of some kind, now We might have to rethink that entire principle. That's one of the key principles of international humanitarian law. Contain or assimilate refugees. This is something every state is going to have to address. A few refugees, sure, that's easy. A couple more, okay. Steady flow. Thousands and thousands and thousands, adding up to possibly millions over time. Do you shut the border? I was a little astonished to see that as many European countries as did shut the border to refugees from Syria. They tried to be generous and they were overwhelmed. They have not been overwhelmed yet, but they're going to be overwhelmed. And finally, infectious disease, I shouldn't say finally, there's more to come. Infectious disease and public health. This is another underemphasized connection between the environment and security. As temperatures grow, remember that scary Earth I showed you? As temperatures grow and the climate in some places gets wetter, you're going to see disease vector ranges and behavior changing. Vector is the thing that connects the disease to the organism that's affected by the disease. So it's mosquitoes, mice, rats, fleas, lice, all the things we call vermin. That is the vector. Those ranges are increasing. We are seeing it now with the Zika virus. It is carried by a couple different species of mosquito, and now it is coming into areas around the world where it's never been. Disease can also be transported inadvertently by troops, by peacekeepers. You know the story of the Nepalese peacekeepers that went to Haiti and brought cholera with them. And they were actually able to type that strain directly back to South Asia. There was no other way it could have gotten there. So now, peacekeepers, Haitians don't want them. Kind of undercuts their mission, doesn't it? Fortunately, and this is something the armed forces is very good at, my hat is off to the armed forces for this, all the services, is that they are conducting a pretty widespread campaign of disease surveillance. Sounds kind of scary, disease surveillance. But this basically means that military and medical labs cooperate with other military and medical labs all over the world to try to track disease. So if we see a disease show up, for example, in Chile, word is sent around the world immediately. Look out for this particular strain of whatever. That's how we found out about SARS. That's how we found out about MERS. That's how we found out about Zika. That's how we knew Ebola was roaring back, because these laboratories cooperate with one another, with the WHO and the CDC in the United States. Climate change, as I mentioned, affects vector range, behavior, and lifespan. It also changes the baseline epidemiology of the country. Now, if you're a deployed soldier going into a particular country, you think you know what you're going to be vaccinated for. You think you know what the disease profile of the nation's going to be. Maybe. Or that could be changing, and you might find yourself suddenly facing a new disease profile you weren't ready for, and that the whole army wasn't ready for. This affects military recruitment, readiness, and operability, as well as undermining public confidence in the government. And this is a map that I got from AFMIC a few years ago of the disease profile of Afghanistan. This is the malaria risk to U.S. forces in, I think, 2004, 2005 that they did this. Now, he told me, the guy I talked to, that they update this all the time. I hope so. They're going to have to. But if you're going to Afghanistan, you know you need to be inoculated for malaria. What else are you going to have to be inoculated for? Unclear. So future engagement. What else do we need to know about the connections between environment and security? And how can the mad scientists help? How can we put our combined brains together to help address this problem? Well, I can't predict the future. I can only describe what I see here. Persistent environmental security issues. And just for fun, I broke these down by combatant command. AFRICOM. If you are in AFRICOM, you are going to be facing a range of problems. Persistent problems. From drought across the Horn of Africa, infectious diseases, food insecurity, the persistence of resource-driven conflicts. The rentier model is a proven method of generating wealth for a nation's 1%, a nation's warlords. That model's not going away anytime soon. Warlords are suddenly not going to be seized with the desire to help humanity. No, they're going to keep making money, and they're going to keep exploiting people to do it. In addition, attempts to help are going to be rebuffed. We've already seen this in Al-Shabaab and other insurgent groups who've seized food aid and killed medical workers. If you're in PACOM, now you're looking at something different. Not quite the same level, but perhaps more widespread. Increasing greenhouse gas emissions from China, India, and other developed countries. Now, that Paris Climate Agreement that we signed, that is a step in the right direction, but it is only a step. It does not fix the problem, not by a long shot. China has agreed to increase and then peak its carbon emissions. India has basically said, get lost. They are not ceding their carbon space to anybody else. So we're going to see increasing carbon emissions across most of the powers in PACOM. Increasing demand for resources. Well, we saw in one of the previous slides about the increasing wealth across China and India and most of Asia. That wealth doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from resources, which means more things are grown, more things are bred, more things are dug up out of the ground, more water's pumped up out of rivers. That's going to put a strain on all these global markets. Infectious diseases such as bird flu and continued petroleum exploitation and continued migration. Now, if you're in CENTCOM, you're looking at, again, the same kind of thing. More frequent droughts and water shortages. There is no way that this is going to make the sectarian issues any better. There's no way this is going to calm in any way the security situation in the Middle East. Food insecurity, more infectious diseases, and vulnerable petroleum infrastructure. I cannot figure out why these insurgent groups are so fixated on airplanes. Hack into a SCADA system and take out some oil wells. That will cause much more economic damage and bring your point home much more clear. Hi, everybody watching on the internet. And finally, even Northcom. Even Northcom, we think we've got it so good here. Sure we do, but we're not free of all this. Melting Arctic, increased polar transit, increased petroleum exploration and production, and we're seeing our own infectious diseases right now, which we may be prepared for. Now, by 2050, I'll do my little predictions of my own here. We're going to be looking at some issues, I think, that have not gotten quite enough light yet. In 2016, this survey was given to the people at Davos, an admittedly non-representative sample of citizens of humanity, but they identified short and long-term, what they see were short and long-term crises. Short-term being large-scale involuntary migration. That's what they're seeing right now. For the next 18 months, 52% of them said that was a problem. State collapse, interstate conflict, unemployment, and failure of national governance. That's what they see happening in the next year and a half. But if you go out 10 years, the profile changes entirely. What are the crises 10 years out? Water, failure of climate change mitigation and adaptation, possibly leading to geoengineering. Extreme weather, food crises, and profound social instability. So it's interesting that we view these things differently. Well, we'll deal with the refugee problem now and put the water shortages off till later. Connected. All right. My predictions. This is a risky business. Failure of food sovereignty contracts leads to regional conflict. Some rich but food insecure nations, Saudi Arabia is an example, they are not the only ones. They have contracted for private land or government-owned land through private contracts for food to be grown in countries such as, for example, Ethiopia, that will be grown for export back to the kingdom. Think about that for a moment. Food grown in Ethiopia is sent back to Saudi Arabia, who bought the land for a 99-year lease, or leased the land for 99 years with the government of Ethiopia. Sure, if I'm the government of Ethiopia, that puts money in my pocket now. But what happens 20 years from now when Ethiopian agriculture is not quite as developed as the Saudis would like and doesn't produce the required amount of food? Is that food going to be sent over to the kingdom, or is that going to be kept by a bunch of angry locals who say, why are we starving when we're shipping our food for export? This could happen in a number of places, causing regional security conflicts. Drought across northern China is going to force migration not only down into southern China, but up into Russia. They are not really looking forward to having many, many Chinese come over the border. It is a relatively unpopulated area, but it is still very firmly Russian. And as the Russian nationalist pride grows, they are not looking to bring in more migrants. Russian de facto control of the Arctic. This is just a given at this point. Russians are far out ahead of most other nations in terms of their Arctic operability. They're not fooling around up there. For some reason, we are. We have one working icebreaker. We're relying on the Canadians to defend us in the Arctic right now. God love the Canadians. What would we be without them? China has icebreakers. Germany is looking to build some. Korea wants to build some. India is interested in this now. Where are we in this whole process? AWOL right now. Resistance to decarbonizing the global energy system is going to push atmospheric carbon well above 2 times CO2, well above pre-industrial concentrations. And that's going to further our path towards that scary red Earth. And this is one I think we're going to see this, and I would be surprised if we didn't. And I'll admit I'm a little sympathetic. The environmentalists are going to get pissed. They're going to take a lesson from the Arab Spring, connect across international borders on social media, and they're going to get angry as they see the global 1% dig up, pump up, grow, breed, and consume more and more wealth to enrich themselves And you're going to see some really pissed off environmentalists who say, hang on, these resources are A, finite, and B, for all of us. Well, what would you do if you were that pissed off and you knew there were other equally pissed off people in other countries? You would find them online. I don't want to call them an environmental ISIS, that's too glib a connection. But you are going to see a connection of environmentalists who are working to change that economic model. And they're going to find each other and they're going to get more powerful. And finally, I want to leave you with one question. This is something I think doesn't often come up in warfighting scenarios. But in terms of the ethical considerations of the environment during war, we have some international humanitarian law right now that says you cannot attack the environment, you cannot use the environment for hostile purposes, environmental modification, you cannot attack the environment for reprisals against the civilian population or any kind of installation containing dangerous forces like a dam or a dike or a nuclear reactor, because then it might imperil the population. But what do we owe to the environment itself during war? These principles of proportionality and discrimination underlie not only international humanitarian law, but just war theory. Do we owe anything to the environment, given that the environment supports every other human endeavor? It is not an accident, ladies and gentlemen, on your binders and so on, that warfighting individual is surrounded by demographics and politics and economy and so on, and surrounding the entire graphic is the global ecology. What do we owe to the global ecology that we don't destroy it in our pursuit of security, whatever that might be? I will stop there, ladies and gentlemen, and take questions. Thank you.
So, Doctor, you
Wait for the microphone.
you didn't wind up addressing the issue of, or your sort of forecast of the trend line of population density in various countries going down. Some of these.
I actually had a demographic slide and took it out.
Yeah, some of these, demographics
Yep.
destiny. What's your sense of the decline in the population growth in India, China, in the next few years? How does that affect your view
Well, the
of how this is going to
population is still
affect
growing.
there?
It's just getting older. It's getting older. That's true. But the numbers are still going up. So by about 2030, short of our 2050 target date here, you're going to see India and China, between the two of them, having half of the world's population. Population is declining in the wealthy countries. We are seeing negative birth rates across most of the wealthy nations. The United States is flat except for immigration. Some European countries, Germany, Italy come to mind. Japan is a severe case where they're actually losing people. People are dying faster than they're being born. They're not interested in having children anymore. So the only way to spread out the wealth is to spread out the people. But you still have this problem with a demographic trend like this, because why would Japanese would rather die out as Japanese than live as anybody else. So they're not looking to increase in-migration from other nations. And as people get wealthier, they want to consume more resources. Your average American consumes about 25 times the average resources of the average Bangladeshi, for example. We like our lives. We don't want to live with 1/25 of what we consume now. But if everybody consumed like Americans, we'd need about 4 or 5 Earths in order to produce all those resources. So I don't see slowing demographic trends as a way out of this mess. I see increasing wealth as offsetting it.
Based on the magnitude of these issues that you bring up and the global scale of it all, as far as influence goes, what are 3 realistic efforts that you think that the U.S. can push for when it comes to our own policies and affecting the policies of our allies?
Do you mean in terms of security, or do you mean in terms of the environment?
In terms of securing the environment so that we can use it to our advantage, because we want to be proactive instead of reactive.
Yes.
So we want to shape the environment in such a way that's beneficial to us.
Okay. Well, I think if we shape the environment in a way it's beneficial, I'm talking about the actual environment, right, not an operational environment. If we shaped it in a way that's beneficial to us, it's going to be beneficial to everybody if we can do this. Then I think that the first step, number 1, is going to have to be a faster transition away from fossil fuels. That's just a given. That's going to take long enough as it is, even if we went in with both feet right now. And we still have some serious foot dragging and climate denial among certain elected politicians. They shall remain nameless, but you know who they are. So if we were able to do that, I think that'd be a huge step. I think number 2, I think revamping the food system. This whole, the graph I didn't show you up here, again, I had a whole bunch of information here and took it out because I didn't want to go too long. But we provide food aid right now on an emergency basis. There's a famine in Ethiopia, we'll provide food aid. There's a famine someplace else or an earthquake or whatever, we'll send food aid, we'll send fresh water. The idea of producing food using industrial agriculture produces quantity, and we're going to need to produce more quantity than ever. But industrial agriculture has its downsides. So we need to take a good hard look at the food system in our country and around the world to try to determine how best we can produce food that is healthy and nourishing for people on a secure basis, so they have it over time. And what's the third one? Okay, this is a little bit touchy-feely, but I would say something that interests me greatly is this idea of nationality, this idea of sovereignty. And here we are Americans, or you know, apologies to other people from other nations who are here, but we are Americans, and we are looking to secure America. Well, America is built on a certain set of lands and a certain set of ideas. The environment that supports those ideas is changing, and we might need to change our definition of what it means to be an American. We might have to change our definition of what it means to be a citizen. I believe a great thinker like Donald Trump has pointed out, and I say this with a smile because, well, whatever. He's pointed out that the elite in the United States has more in common with the elite in China and the elite in Russia and the elite in Malaysia, for example, than they do with their own citizens who are his constituents, the people he purports to represent. I think he's right about that. I think he's right. We need to say, just a minute, what does this mean to be an American? What does this mean to be devoted to your country? And how can we move forward with the idea of environmental sustainability for everybody, not just resource consumption for the 1%? Sounds kind of Marxist. Ooh.
Garth, go ahead.
Yeah, so I actually want to, is it done? Okay. Actually build off your Marxist comment for a bit. Didn't anticipate that connection, but what you're describing seems like the ultimate tragedy of the commons, with the environment as the commons. And so I wanted to ask you, in your work, have you stumbled on or discovered examples where people have come together on their own and made the success of the commons work?
I'm trying to pull up any specific examples in my mind right now, and other than on a very, very tiny scale, like city level and less, no, I haven't. When it comes to the idea of international competition, the incentive to free ride is very strong, the incentive to take advantage of the commons and not contribute to it. So maybe that's some thinking that we have to change. And I'm not saying that Marx is the key. I think he was key. He was very good at pointing out the deficiencies of capitalism, but then he kind of stopped there, and his prescriptions for governance were not so good. But in terms of how do you not wreck the global commons, it is going to take a certain amount of top-down policy. It is going to take a certain amount of thinking about this by people who care about it, by people who understand the inputs into the system. And we saw in one of the first slide presentation, we saw some different options: sustainability, policy, market, and security, if I remember correctly. And sustainability and policy were the two lowest ones. Sustainability was the lowest, everybody individually making these decisions, which I think is what we have to do. And then policy was the second. And that's the only way to govern the commons. Markets are fine in the short term, but market failures happen often and with regularity. So if we're going to try to make sure we have enough resources to be sustainable, that's what sustainable development means, then we're going to have some policies that say we must develop sustainably. Here's what you can do, here's what you cannot do. There's no way around it. Markets won't solve the problem. They can help, but they won't solve it on their own. So I would say smart policy is what we're going to need.
Thank you. That was the last question. Pat.
Chalecki, I'm Colonel Patrick Mahaney, Director of the Chief Staff of the Army Strategic Studies Group. I can think of nobody who better embodies the spirit of the mad scientist than you, based on what we saw here, and I mean that quite as a compliment. So here is the highly coveted mad scientist coin, the truly amazing mood ring cup.
Fantastic.
And you are officially proclaimed, I also will not read it, a mad scientist. Congratulations and thank you for
Thank you very much for having me.